Good evening, everybody. Oh, my dog just vomited on my foot. It's going to be a fantastic hour, I can tell. Thank you, Bailey. Thank you very much. Yep, lovely. One wet foot, one sad dog. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into office hours. My apologies for not being around last month. We had so many things on AI World, which we'll talk about shortly as well. Got lots of things to talk about tonight. It's been a weird couple of months as an Oracle person. You know, the share price does this and we all get excited, and the share price does that and we all get upset. And as I'm sure you've seen in the media, Oracle had some layoffs as well. So there's the excitement of all these major conferences and yet the loss of some good friends, etc. So it's been a very weird couple of months. But enough of that. Let's share my slides. Oh, can someone sing out in the chat line? Make sure they can actually put something on chat. Anything will do. I think I've turned it on for everyone. Anyone can type anything on the chat. Anybody? Nobody. Maybe I haven't got the chat turned on. All right, there we go. Cool. Successful chat. Cool. Let me share my screen and we'll get straight into it. And yeah, so hopefully you can see my slides and you can see me and you can hopefully hear me as well. The fact that someone put something on the chat confirms that for me. That's just going to be gross all day, that foot, but no, not to worry. The joy of having a dog. Let's get into it. As always, getting in touch with me is easy. I love talking tech. Social media seems to be going to a bit of a pivot nowadays. Seems to be where a lot of the action seems to be nowadays on LinkedIn. But yeah, if you go to linktree/Connor or scan the QR code, you can get all my social media channels. But yeah, it's funny how I always put my Twitter DM up there, but I think more or less now it seems to be LinkedIn seems to be the place. So if you like, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If you're new to office hours, I suspect no one is new tonight. It's going to be a fairly quiet night, I think, because as anyone that's in Europe hopefully is at the DOAG conference, which we'll talk about in a second, but there's been the EMEA tour as well. There's been a whole stack of conferences all going on at the moment, so it should be a nice, an intimate little night. Oh, there's something on the chat line already. All good audio and video. Thanks, Brian. No worries. So it'll be an intimate evening. We won't have the usual numbers, which is good. But as I said, if you're new to office hours, don't be surprised when you see the slide content generally pushed across to the left. That's so when we make it into a video with my ugly mug at the top right, we don't lose any of the content. So some bits and pieces. I like to always start with what's going on in the world and to keep people informed and generally to give a shout out to user groups because I'm so passionate about them. A couple of cool things. If you've been using SQL Developer for VS Code, we've got a new release out. 25.3 came out somewhere a week ago, and quickly after that, 25.3.1. Both those things are really expanding on some really cool new features in there in terms of notebooks and graph handling as well. So be sure to check out the notebook stuff in particular. If you're familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, you can now run notebook style stuff in SQL Developer for VS Code. So you can actually build little tutorials and walkthroughs for people. Very cool indeed. The other thing I mentioned in my last office hours is we've now launched an MCP server for the Oracle database. They're coming everywhere nowadays, but this one was talking about mainly against SQL. This is an example of one just to show you the kind of scope that the kind of power you can get now just in VS Code. I loaded up the AI World session catalog into a local database on my machine, and I simply asked the chat window, could you try work out how to give me some recommended sessions? And the interesting thing I put here is notice, you see it says, I apologize for the error somewhere in the middle there. I love this fact that basically it had a crack at querying the table, couldn't find it, said, oh, yep, I've done something wrong. Then it went and listed the list of tables to find the list of tables, then had another crack. And you can see it actually tried a few things before it finally managed to find some sessions. Which makes a lot of sense because in that schema, I think I just used some fairly relaxed names for the names of the sessions and stuff. But it sort of worked it all out. And eventually it came up with some recommendations in nice free text for what I should go see. But I like this idea of the concept of AI now being this more iterative process as opposed to the conventional, you do some chat and it gives you an answer and you don't really ever know whether it's correct or not. This is a bit more iterative. And so just an example of some of the cool stuff that's coming out. Speaking of SQL, there's a fresh download out now with a few bug fixes in it as well, but 25.3 and beyond has all the MCP server stuff. Similarly, just to finish off the trio, SQL Developer, SQL, ORDS, there's a fresh update of ORDS came out, I think, a couple of weeks ago as well. All these things have been out since our last office hours. Okay, now this is a tough one to talk about. As I said, 23 AI, has already been out now already. So why is this slide in here? Because I've obviously spoken with this in months past. Well, if you didn't hear it, AI World, it's now called 26 AI. Now, those of you running 23 AI already, no need to panic. This is simply a reflection of the fact at the executive level that we've been putting so much new stuff into each of the release updates. You think about 19C, release updates generally were bug fixes and security patches. In 23 AI, now 26 AI, it was security fixes, bug fixes, and new functionality in each of these release updates. And the volume of features has grown so much that executives said, well, look, it's actually similar to a new release. So 23 AI is now 26 AI. However, if you're running 23 AI, this does not mean you have to do an upgrade. 26 AI is just the latest release update. It was going to be 23.10, now it's going to be 23.26. Now, for the cynics out there going, oh, you've just did a marketing hack, there actually was a reasonable explanation for this. Most of our cloud software has, when they do iterations, they have the year and a version number. So typically, in some of a lot of stuff on our cloud, it'll be version number .26.1 for the first release in 2026, then 26.2, and then the following year it'll be 27.1, etc. And this makes a lot more sense. Anyone who's on 19C, which I imagine is most people on the call, is probably up to 19.28 now. And you're going, well, what does that really represent? We've had so many release updates now because 19C has been out for so long, it's so mature and so stable, that knowing that 19.8 is what I think it's the October RU, might be the July RU, is difficult. So going forward for 23 AI, it'll be 23.26.1 next year. The one that's just come out now is 26.0. Then it'll be 23.26.2, 0.3.4, and then it'll be 23.27. So actually in the version number, you'll have effectively the calendar year, which obviously makes things easy when it comes to release updates. What happened since I was last here? Well, even Cloud World became AI World. That's how rapidly things changed. When I spoke to you last in September, it was called Cloud World. And then by the time office hours came along, it was rebadged to AI World. I imagine some marketing people had some fun with that. It was a fantastic event. As always, caught up with all my good friends in Oracle living in Perth. I don't get to see them face to face that often. Really remarkable event. If you can't get to Vegas, check out the AI World Tour. Like last year, we're bouncing around countries all over the world to bring the AI World experience to you if you couldn't get to Vegas. Something else I did just the other week, I went to South Africa for the first time for the South African User Group Conference. If you're in Europe or on the African continent or anywhere where you could fly reasonably, I cannot recommend this conference highly enough. My first time ever there, absolutely fantastic, very professionally run event, very cheap to attend, really, really lovely bunch of people, organisers. The woman on the right there is Deb. She's the core organiser for the event, did a fantastic job. Had a whole bunch of students come in. We had a dedicated students track as well. And as you can see, the South African User Group people, attendees, they know how to party. Rest assured, I didn't get up and dance because the last thing I wanted to be was humiliated in front of my peers. Also just a quick shout out to Brovantia, an EPM company. They were generous enough to let me tag along on one of their safaris. So yeah, some very, very cool stuff there. I got to feed a giraffe. But so big thanks to Brovantia because they had no real need to actually invite a database guy along for their little safari, but they were very nice people. So thanks to them. And the reason we have low numbers tonight is because we're right in the middle of the DOAG user conference. There's a stack of content coming out of there and a stack of Oracle people over there. Maria Colgan, Hassan, just like literally the who's who of Oracle is floating around at the DOAG conference. I wish I was there. Personally, for me, if you're in my part of the region, next week, start on Monday, we got the Perth conference. Literally, I'll be able to drive to a conference once, no getting on a plane. And then on the Wednesday, we have the Melbourne conference. And then on the Friday, we have the New Zealand conference. So if you're in APAC, please try to get along to them. We didn't have conferences last year, so we're trying to reinvigorate the local community. So please, the Melbourne, Perth, and New Zealand conferences, that one's in Wellington. If you're in my region, please come along and say hello. And last one, Next week or the week after is the annual UK OEG conference. Shout out to Zahir, who does a fantastic job with the team organising all of that. Once again, that'll be a really good fun conference as well. All that, of course, brings me to support your local user groups. Cannot stress that enough. Oh, I've got something in the Q&A. I so rarely see the Q&A. Oh, question from Brian. Today's my first office hours attendance. Fantastic. Welcome along. I'm currently 11G Pro certified. I feel so far behind after knowing the latest version 26 AI. What certification upgrade path would I recommend? That's an excellent answer. We can divert to that because anyone who is certified is welcome to throw their input on the chat as well. For me, Brian, I would look at tackling the most current release of the Oracle Certified Master Program. Now, that's a non-trivial certification. It actually requires a fair bit of study, some training, and live real-time exams, not just Q&A. It's actually practical work in terms of doing things with a database. The reason I recommend that is there's very few OCMs on the planet, so it really does stand you apart from a whole stack of Oracle professionals, and it removes immediately that criticism people have of certification where, oh, someone just did an exam cram and they did the 50 quiz questions and they got through it. I wrote a blog post years ago about certification. I don't think certification means you're an Oracle expert, but if you're an Oracle expert, it's always good to get certified because a lot of industries seem to like that particular attribute about you when you're interviewing in this competitive world. But yeah, OCM. I don't know what the latest OCM is. I don't think there's a 23AI OCM program yet. It might be still at the 19C program. But whatever it is, I would go for the Oracle Certified Master. It's not trivial. It's not cheap. But rest assured, if you do it, then it really does stand you apart in the Oracle community. So hopefully that answers that question. Thanks. As always, I like to consider us friends here. So for me, I always like people throwing things on the chat as opposed to the Q&A because it just makes it feel a little less formal. Where was I? Oh man, I've been meandering. It's 9:12 already. Dearie me. What have we got tonight? Efficient creation of materialized views, duplicate aliases in SQL, sessionless transactions, a 26 AI feature, how to do SQL trace on a cloud database where you have no operating system access, why the coalesce partition command is so expensive, truncate, why would it truncate, which is meant to be like that, why is it can be very slow, and a question that came in saying they cannot use our cool new UUID function as a default. So these are questions that have come in from the community, and hopefully we'll try to get through most of them tonight. Okay. Thanks, Elaine, for putting a link there to the OCM exam registration. So Brian, check out the chat, and there's a link there from Elaine. Thank you very much. Number 1, offline materialized view creation. Here's the question that came in. We want to build materialized views at a second site, which will be fast refreshable from a primary site. Some of these materialized views will be hundreds of gigabytes. Can they be built without doing the initial data drag across the network? Because a typical materialized view, you would simply do create materialized view as select star from, or select set of expressions from table at remote database, and the first create materialized view will drag all the data required across the network to actually populate it. That's fine if you're in the same data center, but if you've got a slow network, that could be problematic. So I'm going to give 2 solutions here, and I say 2 solutions. The second one I put in inverted commas because it doesn't really work. I was surprised, but let me do 2 solutions now which will let you effectively instantiate the materialized view without having to do that refresh or that drag of data across the network, without still losing the consistency with the main site. So let's fire up our first demo for the night. Let's check in the right spot. I've already forgotten what I called it. Okay, so hopefully you can still see the code on the screen. So I've got a couple of databases here, PDB21A and PDB21B. They're actually both pluggables in the same container database, but for our purposes, they're the equivalent to 2 remote databases. I'm going to create a very, very simple table here called T. It's got X, Y as 2 integers and a timestamp column. And I'm just going to insert some data in there. I actually left the timestamp empty. I just wanted to put 1,000 rows or thereabouts in there. If I'm going to create a fast refreshable materialized view, I need to create a materialized view log on the source table, which captures all the deltas. I'm going to grant select on my table T to a user called demo. And what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to create a materialized view in my local database. Now that sounds strange given that the idea is to instantiate materialized view in a remote database, but bear with me, we'll see why this is useful. So I connect as a new schema demo in the same database, and this schema called demo is going to have materialized view. I'm just being lazy here. The reason I put it in a brand new schema is you'll see shortly we're going to do a data pump. It lets me do a schema level data pump. I don't have to list the tables, etc. So I've got refresh fast on demand, and refresh fast is allowed because I have a materialized view log. And for this case, it's just a straight clone of the data. Materialized views can have all sorts of complexity, joins, and aggregation, but I'm keeping it very, very simple. It's just a copy of the data with some different column names from the source database. Now, this is the interesting thing that's important here. This source database DB link actually points back to my local database. It is a database link that goes back to PDB21A. Everything here is being done locally, but I have a materialized view created. The reason I do that is what it lets me do is I'm going to copy that materialized view definition and its data, not using the network. So just to prove this is going to work, I connect now with Scott and normal DML is continuing. So I initially had 1,000 rows in there, and I've gone and created another 50 rows and I created the materialized view before that. So this thing is now stale, it's out of date. I've done this to prove that when we put it in our new database, we'll still be able to fast refresh it. So now the materialized view is no longer up to date with the real data in Scott.t. This is how I'm going to instantiate my materialized view. I'm simply going to use a data pump. So this avoids the need of dragging the data across the network. So I'm simply data pumping out the entire demo schema. I put everything in that one schema because it makes my life easy. Data pump chugs away, doing all its bits and pieces. Poor little laptop's working hard. I'm making idle chit chat, and we're done. So we can see the materialized view only contained 1,000 rows, even though the base table now has 1,050. But the beauty of using data pump is I can take this dump file, I can gzip it, I can compress it, I can do all the good things, and I can copy it much faster than, say, across SQLnet to get it to my remote site. I'm not, I could even copy it to a tape and put it in a truck and drive it over there if I had to. Once it's on my remote site, I then just import it straight back in. That's nice and fast. So here I'm importing into the PDB21B schema. So I've actually moved this data pump file to a new database and I've imported it in there. If I now connect to my demo schema in my remote database, my materialized view is now there, which is fantastic. However, it's only got 1,000 rows, and back at the source database, I've now got 1,048. Not to worry though, even though I've used data pump, because I copied the materialized view definition over, when I do a refresh, it still preserves the materialized view definition. The source DB now points to the remote database, PDB21A, and my refreshes work as per normal. So now I've got fast refresh and I never had to drag the data across the network. So that's pretty cool. The only downside of that is I had to create the materialized view in my local database first. So I do need space for a local copy before I transport it over using data pump. That's the downside. So after I did this, I thought, well, maybe I could do it in a different way. Maybe I could use the pre-built table option in materialized views to avoid having to consume that local space. Now, I didn't get this to work, give you full disclosure in advance, but I thought I'd show you, and I'll leave it as a reader exercise. I can't help thinking I should be able to get this to work, but I couldn't. But I'll show you what I did, and then if anyone wants to take this and run with it and prove me wrong, that would be awesome. As I said, we're all here to prosper together. So this was my second attempt to see if I could avoid the overhead of having a fully materialized view inside the local database before I could data pump it over. So we're starting once from scratch. I create my table, I put 1,000 rows in there, I create a materialized view log just as before, I grant select to the demo schema. In my demo schema, I'm not creating a materialized view, I'm just creating a view. So in this case, this obviously consumes no space. I'm going to try data pump this over and then create a materialized view and see how we go. So how do you data pump a view as if it was a materialized view? Well, thankfully, there's actually a parameter for that. We can actually do this in data pump. You can say, when I see a view, export it as if it was a table. So that's pretty cool. So even though it's actually a view, you can see it exported the MV as 999 rows. it created a MV table out of my view called MV on the local site. I then imported in the same way. In it goes. Now, if I go back to my source table and simulate real DML, so my source table once again has some extra DML going in, I now go into my remote database, PDB21B, and because I've now got a table in my database already called MV, I use create materialized view on a pre-built table. So I'm telling the database, you don't have to go get the data. I've already pre-populated this table, and it's the same definition. So there's my 1,000 rows. Life is good. I count my source database. It's got 1,050 rows. So now a DBMS view refresh should bring this materialized view up to date. And unfortunately, it doesn't. This is my stumbling block currently with using this pre-built table option. And I think the reason it happens is because at the point I run this create materialized view, this is the line in the sand at which the database says from now onwards I need to do a fast refresh. So even though I've got outstanding changes in my materialized view log from my source database, they're pretty much ignored because they created before I actually did the create materialized view definition. So I haven't been able to overcome this yet, but I can't help thinking that there must be some way. I could manually go look at the materialized view log and work out what deltas have to be done to that table, but that seems to defeat the purpose of using the refresh pass mechanism. But that's where I'm at the moment. So as long as you've got the space locally, you can do it just with data pump. I'll keep playing with this and hopefully one day get an example where we can use the pre-built table option as well and see if we can get some benefit there. That's number one. Duplicate aliases. Here's the question that came in. Now, I have to say, Sandor, I see Sandor raised hand keep popping up. I'm not sure if you're trying to ask me something, Sandor, but if you are, please put it in the chat. I just know it keeps coming up saying Sandor's raising his hand actively. So yeah. Duplicate aliases. Here is the... Oh, and now Manfred's raised his hands. These people are messing with me tonight. I think it's because I got dog vomit on my shoe, on my foot. Yuck. Duplicate aliases. Here's the question that came in. I mistakenly duplicated an alias in a complex SQL, but did not get an error. Why is that? Well, that's a long story, and perhaps the easiest way of describing it is because ANSI joins don't really exist in Oracle. And just as a little bit of background, way back in Oracle 8, the only way you could do a join in Oracle was to use the Oracle syntax for the join, which you may be familiar with. It always, where column equals some other column. For an outer join, it would be where column equals some other column, and then the little brackets and a plus sign. That's all we supported. Now, that wasn't the ANSI standard, which has the left outer, right outer, inner join, etc. So in Oracle 9, we introduced support for the ANSI join. Now, one of the nifty things, and people criticize us for this, but I actually think it was a really smart thing, is when we saw this, we said what we'll do is we'll take your ANSI join and rewrite it as an Oracle join and then run that. Now, people say, oh, that's cheating. I thought this was a very smart idea because you think about the Oracle optimizer and the Oracle query transformer. It's literally got, at that point, 2 decades of intelligence in it into how to best optimize joins, how to best optimize queries. Why would you want to write another huge layer of code for how to optimize ANSI join, brand new syntax? If you can simply convert it to old style joins, all that code still exists. It's far less regression testing, far less regressions for customers. I just thought it was a smart idea. What that means is ever since Oracle 9, where we have all this great ANSI join support, we actually convert your joins to non-ANSI joins before we actually run them against the database. Now, what that does is introduce some interesting anomalies, which we'll see right now. Oh, chat. No worries, Sandor. Thanks for saying no. That's okay. Okay. All right. I nearly typed in Sandor. Deary me. So this is a nice quick one to show you simply what goes on here. I've got 3 tables here: customer, customer sales, customer department. I populate some data into them. What's actually going here doesn't really matter. I just created 3 tables so we could do a simple ANSI join. I'm doing select from cus sales A, inner join customer department B. And then being a inefficient developer, when I did the next inner join to the customer table, I meant to put in C or something else, but instead of going A, B, and C, or something like cust sales, cust depth, and cust, I did A, B, and B. Now you would expect that must be invalid, and surely I'd get an error, but the query ran fine. And that was the question that came in. How does this query run fine? Surely the Oracle database should complain and say you've got a duplicate alias. It will complain if there was a column called b.price in both of these, and therefore it could not be resolved. But in reality, in this particular case, there was only a price on this column, and so there's nothing in there that fundamentally breaks the query. The database can resolve it all, but you would still expect that multiple aliases should give an error. To see what's going on, we can take advantage of a very cool utility called dbms utility expand SQL text, which says, here's the SQL you threw at the database. This thing will simply say what actually will be presented to the Oracle optimizer and kernel at the time we actually come to execute it. What transformations and fiddling around do we do before we actually start running the thing? So you can use this for any SQL text, and what happens is it simply says, take the expanded SQL and put it into this clob here, and then we can have a look at the clob. So if I run that and print out the clob, it looks like this. I simply took this and formatted it so we could go through it a bit more carefully. This is your non-ANSI joined SQL. We took that ANSI join, we transformed it to remove any ANSI join so we can run it with old style Oracle joins, and this is what we did. Notice that we invent our own aliases and for columns and our own aliases for tables. A5, A4, A2, A3, A1 for inline views, etc. This transformation has cleaned up your mistake, and as a result, the query now runs. This is what's actually happened. We actually removed your aliases in the act of transforming the query, and that's why it ran. So it's a nice simple explanation why. I will say it's a bug. It should fail. And there's actually a Moz note there which talks about the various scenarios here, why if b.price could not be resolved correctly, you would get an error. So in that Moz note, we talk about the ORA 918 error, and also the fact that this is actually, we recognize this is that we should actually fail your SQL with a duplicate alias before we even get to the transformation phase. So that's a bug that we recognize, but at the moment, just be aware that, obviously, please try use unique aliases for all your queries. That's just good programming practice. But if you don't, be aware you'll get this sort of ambiguous behavior where depending on the columns you're selecting, you might get an error or you might get the query running correctly. So just be aware of that. Okay. I know this is preemptive. You're going to love this one. This is going to blow your minds. A sessionless transaction. Here's the question that came in. I was watching the AI World Digital On Demand. Let's try that again in English. I was watching the AI World Digital On Demand replays and saw a reference on a slide to a sessionless transaction. What is that? Or more precisely, how can you have a transaction without a session? Because obviously to start a transaction, you have to connect to the database, which means you have a session. The underpinnings of this feature are related more to microservices, but I've said sort of, because it's not necessarily an issue with microservices, it's an issue with the way microservices are commonly used, which is you do some piece of work, you start some work, and then you go call other services, you do other things, and then you want to come back and continue this work. Microservices fragment up what would logically often be a single unit of work into multiple components, and each of those components might require some back and forth to the database. So we can explore this not in the world of microservices, but even just normal database activity whenever you have something which takes maybe a long time to run. So I'm going to show you a demo here, which isn't microservices, but hopefully explains why I think sessionless transactions are an absolute game changer when it comes to the typical modern stateless applications. So I'm going to pick up the right window here, fresh color. Oops, maybe one more S. Okay, a sessionless transaction. Now, is that a big enough font? Do I need to make it bigger? See out in the chat if you want it bigger. Hopefully you can all read that. 3, 2, 1. we're continuing on. I'm going to create a scenario here where I have an application where I'm basically trying to book a travel to a remote destination. And in the good old days, you walked into your travel agent when there was no internet, you went to your travel agent and they did this magic. Yeah, it always used to blow me away. You'd simply say, I'd like to book a flight, and you'd simply tell them the date and the time, and they would type away for hours, on all this stuff, typing in all these bizarre codes. But underneath, back in the underlying system, the underlying database, ultimately you could book a flight, you put your name on a flight, and then you could book a seat. So I'm going to simulate an application here, which is the old style way of booking a seat on a plane. So in this case, this is my flight booking table. The travel agent's in there. They're saying, yep, I'm on Qantas flight 642. I want to see if anyone has got seat 42A. Yeah, I would love to do this demo saying I got seat 7A or 5A up at the front, but that's not the real world. Let's keep it realistic. So is anyone currently in seat 42A? Allocated to no one, and I'm going to lock that row. This is how applications used to work. You would lock the row, see if I get a row back. If I do, that means, yep, I can now put Connor McDonald into that seat. So we simply update that row that we've locked, and the job is done. There we go. Connor McDonald now gets seat 42A, and we can commit the transaction. I've rolled it back because I want to do several scenarios here. This is how applications used to work in the good old days. One unit of work, one transaction. But the world has changed. Right? The world has changed because we have now stateless activity, right? We have internet transactions where what happens is people use their browser and they may never come back. So let me repeat the problem here. This is how modern applications now work. If I came in and did this same behavior, I simply locked the row, making sure no one has currently got the seat. Well, you don't go to travel agents anymore. What happens is you're using a browser, and what happens when you try to book a seat now on an air flight? Well, it doesn't work like this. The first thing you do is, well, this is a Qantas flight, but they're a partner with American Airlines. I need to call the American Airlines services to make sure they haven't allocated the seat, making sure that's happened. Then I need to call the Emirates service, another partner of Qantas, to make sure they haven't allocated the seat. Then maybe I call the Qatar service. And then, of course, nowadays, being able to get any seat in the plane is very dependent on your frequent flyer status. Does Connor have enough flyer miles that let him get that seat? Maybe it's a window seat. We don't give people as lowly as me a window seat option. So we call the frequent flyer service. And as I'm sure as anyone else who has been on a plane lately, you've got to pay for seats nowadays. And so you call the payment service. All this stuff goes on, which means this is now an extremely long-running transaction, unlike the good old days where it was select for update, update, commit. I've now locked this row for a long, long time. Locking a row for a long, long time isn't a big drama. However, what is a big drama is if that row is locked and I'm using an internet application, then I'm currently occupying a connection pool session. All this time while I'm calling all these services, I've got this active transaction, which means I'm using a session on the database. If my session pool, my connection pool has 4 sessions in total, normally I have a lot more, this one is in use for the entire duration of all that stuff until it comes back and says, yes, I've passed all these checks. Now you can go ahead and do your update and actually commit. If other people, other passengers are doing that same activity, then next thing you know, Susie is in the middle of some giant long-running set of transaction trying to get her seat, as is Mike, as is Mary. Huge long-running transactions and connection pools are not good friends. Because now what you've got is no more connection pool sessions, you've got problems. If you go add more sessions to your connection pool, then what have you got? You're starting to overload your database service because typically you choose the number of sessions in your connection pool for what is the appropriate amount of load for your database server. If you have all these long-running transactions all sitting on connections, then that's a bad thing to do. How have we solved this currently? Currently, we solve it with a huge amount of complexity. This is what the kind of things we do. We go add a transaction status column and a transaction timeout column. You'll see how these work in a second. This is how we're currently solving this problem with stateless applications running on browsers using connection pools. We've solved it ourselves with a whole lot of hassle. This is what a typical application now looks like in current form. I still do the select for update, right? I start my transaction. Then what I do is I say, yep, I'm going to give it to Connor but I'm not sure if Connor's actually allowed to get it yet because I haven't called all those other services. So what I do is I say your ability to have this seat is actually pending. And you're allowed to sort of try to get this seat for up to, in this case, 3 minutes for seat 42A on slight skew of 64. I've got this row now. Yep, Connor might be able to have this seat, but what I can do now is commit the transaction. I have freed up that connection pool now because I was able to end this transaction. I haven't really given the seat to me yet. I'm simply saying you might be able to get it, but at least I'm stopping anyone else from getting it. But because I've been able to do a commit now, I've freed up that connection pool session. Now I can go call the American Airlines service, the Emirates service, the Qatar service, the frequent flyer micro service, the payment service, all those things. Now, if all those things pass, I can come back and finish off the work. So I get a brand new session in the connection pool and I say, yep, as long as I came back within 3 minutes, I can now set your status to confirmed. And yep, I've gone from pending to confirmed, and it is indeed the case that Connor McDonald will be able to sit in seat 42A. Now, I've added all this extra complexity, but also now I've got a problem because what if I didn't come back within 3 minutes? What if one of those services hung or failed? Now I've got a seat that says pending to me. Who's going to sort that out? So now I've got to have a garbage collection routine that goes and looks for expired pending transactions, etc. I've just introduced a whole layer of extra application coding and complexity to handle this problem. It's a nightmare. So let's fix it with this sessionless transaction feature, which will blow your mind. So I'm going to get rid of the allocated to. I'm going to drop those columns. I don't want all that complexity in there. Let's go back to the initial state. Here is the cool thing you can do with these things called sessionless transactions. I've jumped on, Connor wants to get seat 42A. I'm going to create a transaction and give it an actual name, a unique name. On flight QF654, I'm interested in seat 42A. This is just an arbitrary name I've come up with. I could have used a GUID for all I care. As long as something I can remember, I've given it a nice name so we sort of have an understanding what's going on. But I've started this transaction. I've given it a name. Now I can go do my select for update and my update. I've simply said, yep, Connor gets the seat. Now, I haven't really guaranteed my seat yet because I haven't called all those other services yet. But if I go look at the table, I said, yep, here is an active transaction. I haven't committed it, saying, yep, Connor gets this seat. That row is locked. I seem to be heading down that same path now of a long-running transaction stuck on the connection pool. But here's the cool thing. I can now suspend that transaction, which means this transaction is still active. That row is still locked, uncommitted transaction, but I have given away my rights to it. I am no longer a party to that transaction in this session. Why is that good? Because now I can give my session back to the connection pool. I no longer have a long-running transaction. I have a long-running or an outstanding lock, but I don't have a long-running transaction. Let's say I've called all the other services now, and I come back and say, yep, I'm ready to continue this transaction. I'm ready to commit it. Well, I gave my session away. I'm going to get allocated just any arbitrary brand new session. Here's an example of I've been allocated a brand new session on the connection pool. So when I come in this other session, which I've come back to finish the work, I can't see that transaction anymore because it's a different session. We can't see uncommitted changes in someone else's session. However, this is the cool thing. I can say, as long as I know the name of the transaction, I would like to resume it in this other session. I've taken ownership of this transaction from the original session and brought it into my session. I can now see the uncommitted transaction in my session. This person can no longer see it. I've passed it around. I'm happy with that. I can see there's actually an active transaction now in my session. I can commit the change and the change has been done. If I come back to session 1 and do a query, it actually is now committed in this session. It was committed over here, but therefore visible in this session. So I've simply solved the long-running transaction on connection pools without having to hold onto those sessions, without having to add timeouts and garbage collection, all that kind of stuff. This is absolutely a game changer for all modern applications which have this paradigm, which is I need to do stuff on a connection pool without ever having to do a long-running transaction But if I'm in a microservice, guess what? I'm probably going to have lots of little transactions that come and go. So yeah, very cool. As we saw in the demo, the locks still exist. It's not like we're getting rid of locks. The locks still exist to hold onto those resources in rows. The fantastic feature here is that we can disconnect our session from those locks in order to let other sessions come along later and grab them. Now you might be wondering, what if I never came along in that second session? What if I never came back to this transaction and resumed it and tried to grab it? Well, the concept of timeout is all handled by the transaction API itself. I should have showed you in the set where I started the transaction, it actually could nominate a timeout. By default, I think it's 10 days. But yeah, you can nominate a timeout saying, if you don't come back to this transaction and try to resume it within a certain amount of time, we'll simply roll back the transaction, free up the lock. You don't have to write your own routines to do that for yourself. So it's very cool. Okay, chat. Elaine said, what if I don't remember the transaction name? Well, you could try guessing, but yeah, you'll simply not be able to resume that transaction, and therefore it will eventually time out and roll back, etc. I gave it a nice, meaningful name, but typically what is the more common scenario is you don't care what the name is. You just want something that you can remember, and so you'll typically allocate a GUID and then come back. You'll remember that GUID and come back and try to resume that GUID over time. Okay, and we had a question from an anonymous attendee. Okay. We're using database file system with lots of databases in our xCloud customer setup. It seems quite flaky. Many teams complain they often get errors while xCloud is running files DBS. The only fix so far is that sometimes helps is when DBA unmounts and mounts DBFS. Is there a more logical and proper way to diagnose why DBS fails so frequently? That is outside my remit of expertise, so I wouldn't want to make up an answer or give you some false, some false information. Whenever things fail, I can't stress enough, first thing is head to support. Raise an SR because they'll be able to pick up all the logs and deal with it. Now, one thing I will say for anyone logging in SR, people often say, oh, that's a cop-out, we don't like dealing with support, we don't get good support, etc. I stress to people, you pay good money for support. So always use all the facilities at your available. So log an SR. If you're unhappy with the response, don't just go, oh, that sucks, and close the SR. Escalate the SR. Ask it to go to the supervisor, right? After supervisor, you can escalate it even further. I think they're called the duty manager. But there are levels of escalation when it comes to Oracle support. Use all these facilities that you're available. If you're still unhappy, right, get your local account manager on board and get them to escalate the SR as well, right? That way you can get on, and if that doesn't work, escalate the severity. If that doesn't work, keep pushing the severity up. Right. There are lots of tools at your disposal to make sure you're getting the support that you have rightfully paid for. I'm always, I'm 25 years an Oracle customer and 10 years an Oracle employee. So I know about dealing with Oracle support. And yeah, I always stress to people, make sure you get the most out of your support investment. Don't just sit on a bad response from an SR. Push it and push it and push it. Hopefully that helps. Okay. Eunice has said, is this similar to the kind of thing that could be done with DBMS XA? Yes, but a lot of DBMS XA stuff isn't as flexible as this in terms of, and what's more, it's a lower level. You have to manage a lot of the transactional infrastructure yourself. In particular, some of the things in DBMS XA aren't available in the Oracle call interface at a lower level. So yeah, DBMS XA is fine, but it's a lot more complicated to use than something as simple as sessionless transactions. Where are we up to? Man, I've been talking too much, haven't I? 15 minutes to go. Dearie me. Okay. SQL trace on autonomous. I did a blog post on this recently. And so if you've seen this, then this may be a little bit repeated. But I wanted to put it in the office hours session because I've had a lot of people asking me about this or criticizing SQL trace on autonomous. So I wanted to cover it in the video so I could publish it and get it out to the masses. I was reading the blog post describing how to activate SQL trace on autonomous, and I put the link to the blog post you can see there. But simply setting SQL trace to true does not capture the wait information. This makes it useless in my humble opinion. I sympathize with that sentiment. I do find SQL trace with waits to be far more valuable than without. There's still intrinsic value in SQL trace, but having it with waits obviously adds a bit more. The justification for this is in an autonomous environment, we are obviously trying to push customers toward using the tools within the autonomous framework and not have to revert to or have to rely on stuff that I suppose is from a pre-autonomous era. And so I say yes and no to my answer. Yeah, the weights is useful, but the reason I think SQL Trace maybe should be rather than your first option, but more your last resort is there's a whole lot of cool stuff in autonomous that people generally don't use because often they don't choose to go to the cloud browser environment. And don't get me wrong, I'm a dinosaur DBA as well, command line for the win, but there are a lot of very cool tools in the autonomous cloud environment that don't require things like Enterprise Manager, etc. They're just sitting there in your effectively autonomous environment. One of them is Performance Hub. So you get all the things that you would get like in Enterprise Manager. You get active session history, and you get like top running SQLs. You can see this one there. I could click in and go to SQL monitoring and drill in on it, and you can get all the stuff that you would normally rely on SQL Trace to use. I've got a bad running SQL. Let's see where it spent its time. Well, that's what a SQL monitor report's very good to do. So I just wanted to put these out there first to realize that SQL Trace, maybe don't think about leaping into SQL Trace because maybe you didn't have these facilities on your on-prem database. All these facilities are there, sitting there in your browser when it comes to autonomous. I encourage you to exploit them in order to actually get them. But you can see here, I was running this select, SSE line loader query. And once again, if you go to that blog post to set up SQL Trace, be aware that you do need to create what's called a bucket in object storage. I've created one called DB bucket here. So you need to use your browser to create a bucket. But once you do that, then there's a few commands. To fly through the blog post, you create a credential using your cloud username, and you set up what's called an authorization key. You create a credential, which lets the database store things into object storage. You then set a database property of the default logging bucket. This is where your SQL Trace files will go. And then you set what we call a default credential, the one we just created here. You need default logging bucket and default credential set in order to run SQL Trace on your autonomous database. But once you've done that, it's the normal way. Turn your SQL Trace on, do your workload, turn your SQL Trace off, and then you can get the trace file from the object store credential. Nice and simple. Okay. Now, one thing I should say also is rather than having to get the trace file from the object store, you can also just run select from session cloud trace in your current session, and it will give you the actual trace file contents right there in your session. In the same way that on-prem, you can do select from $diags trace file contents. This is the same way you can do it on the cloud, but we're getting it from the bucket. Slight diversion here from Narendra. What do we got? What would be the best way to keep track of a transaction name so I don't have to remember it? Well, I don't think that's really the intention of how sessionless transaction would be work. I view it in the same way that, for example, let's just say you're doing something with a database queue. When you put a message on a queue with a correlation ID, then part and parcel of your application framework is if I want to get that message back off again, you would know the correlation ID. I think whatever tag you come up with a transaction name is something that's just going to be sitting there in your application. Like it'll be your application code that says start a transaction, which will return the name. Then it'll, using my metaphor again, it'll call the Qantas service, call the Emirates service, call whatever. This is all going to be sitting in your application code. And then eventually you're going to say, yep, I passed all these checks. I need to now go back and start this transaction again. I can't think of a reason why you would need to go fetch in some way that transaction, because the piece of code you're running is literally related to the transaction ID you just went and created. I hope that maybe explains. Okay. Narendra's saying Performance Hub shows data from Ash and AWR, which is getting the relative second rather than the buffer. Yes, but your Ash buffer is generally going to last a huge amount of time in autonomous because the SGAs are ridiculously huge. And so when it comes to that, don't forget, SQL Trace you have to do proactively now. So if you're saying that your AWR buffer is now 10 seconds old and therefore out of date, well, SQL Trace is too late anyway. Because if you're going looking at something that happened an hour ago, or let's say 12 hours ago, which is no longer in your Ash buffer, well, you can't SQL Trace that anyway. So that's gone. If you're looking at something that's happening right now, then you've got that 1 second Ash granular activity. And similarly, if you're looking at something right now, which is what you would do SQL Trace for, then you can also click on SQL monitoring to get long-running SQLs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to trash SQL Trace. I'm saying that SQL Trace is often not going to have to be your first point of call. it'll often be your, maybe your last resort. Because long-running SQLs, SQL Monitor is going to be perfect for that. Because it's going to show the execution and the wait information anyway. If you've got for an application which seems to be slow doing some sort of operation, but all the SQLs seem really, really fast, maybe it's the volume of SQLs, that's where SQL Trace might come in useful, and that's where you might choose to do it. But as I said, I think it's going to be less of a priority than it used to be in the past. Okay. Okie dokie. So, as we've said here, the problem with SQL Trace on Autonomous is you don't get the wait information. However, you can cheat, and this is something I discovered. To be honest, I don't know if this is intentional or by design, or so whether it'll stay or disappear, but I'll show you how you'll be able to do it. So I need to start up my Autonomous database here, which is one running elsewhere. So just to show, on this Autonomous version, I've already set up the credential and I've done all the bits and pieces so we can move straight on to. I'm turning on select SQL Trace equals true, and I'm doing a very expensive query. SSE line order, I think, has 4 billion rows in it. It's one of the sample schemas in Autonomous. And so I've turned on tracing. Hopefully this runs in about 15 seconds. I was timing it today. And then I turned SQL Trace off. This is me querying Session Cloud Trace. The complexity here is just I didn't want to query the whole trace file. I'm simply looking for where the word line order starts and then getting everything past that. So we just get a little bit of the trace file. And we see there's my query. And I've got all the cool things with SQL Trace. I've got the execution and the timing, etc., and the fetch timing. However, no wait information, which is a bummer. That's a pain. Now, the kind of things you might want to do normally, which is, for example, I'll do alter set of session events. You can't do that on Autonomous. Maybe I'll do session trace enable. You can't do that on Autonomous either. So it seems that we're a bit stuck. However, this is something I discovered. Once you've turned on SQL Trace, if you do dbms monitor session trace enable, please turn the waits on and then run your query and then turn off trace. It appears to be the case that wait information is captured as well, which is quite nice. So if I come back, run the same query from my Session Cloud Trace, notice my wait information is caught as well. And because it's a parallel, we've got all the parallel information in there. So that's very, very cool, right? You can cheat. You can turn your trace on, then do dbms monitor session trace enable, turn the waits on, and it seems to work. So I honestly don't know whether it's by design, and so it may disappear one day, but that's how I'm currently using it to actually go and actually collect the wait information, which makes SQL Trace just that much more valuable even when you're on Autonomous. 9:52. Yeah, we probably got time for one more. Okay, Narendra's saying I didn't read this whole question. I think I answered your question, to be honest, Narendra. I think I covered it all. Anyway, it is on the hour, so we didn't get through our questions, so we'll save them for next month. But on that note, next month is the typical end of year thing we do, which is what I call the Ask Me Anything. And the Ask Me Anything is what we do is we simply say, it's free form. We have some slides there which we can sort of fall back to, but the end of month office hours for me is always just, hey, do you want to come along and just hang out? And we'll have some fun as well. Okay, so that's the plan. So thank you very much for your time. That's it for today, and hopefully we'll see you next month on office hours. Bye for now, everybody.